In the previous movie, we created this 3D type logo using TextPlus. Now we'll fine-tune this by adjusting its level of detail and also adjust the typography on a per-character basis with interactive manipulation. Let's do that first. We'll go into the front viewport, click in that view and maximize it with Alt-W. Select the TextPlus object, go to the Modify panel, and in the Parameters rollout, turn on Manipulate Text. Then you'll need to click on the type object itself, and you'll see little yellow dots in the center of each one of those characters. And you'll be able to manipulate each one of those individually when you click on the yellow dot. Once I click on the yellow dot for that K, I have access to its transform tools. So for example, I can scale that K up. And if I want to scale uniformly, I'll click on the arrow on the upper right corner and drag that and set the scale of that letter. I can also scale non-uniformly using the arrow on the top here, so I can scale up or down. I'll undo that with Control-Z. We can change the baseline by adjusting the control here on the bottom, set that to a different baseline, undo that. Or I can adjust the kerning, but I won't get any result if I try to kern this first letter. I want to change the spacing between the K and the I. I'll need to select the I. So click on that I yellow dot, and then click again in the center to adjust the kerning between those two letters. All right, that's super cool. So I can exit out of Manipulate Text and go back to my 4 viewport layout with Alt-W. Let's talk about level of detail now. Right-click in the perspective view so we don't lose our selection. Maximize that with Alt-W. And as we saw with the bevel modifier, if we ever want to deform this type, for example, bend it or twist it, we don't have enough detail by default. We'll need to change up some settings to get better results for deformation. But it's all built into the TextPlus primitive. So back in the Modify panel, if we scroll down a little bit, we'll want to make sure we're showing the advanced parameters. So if that's not enabled, turn that on. And the first thing we'll adjust is the number of steps per extrusion. And that's this steps parameter here. But we'll need to turn Optimize off first. And if we orbit or tumble around with Alt and middle mouse button, we can see we've increased the number of steps on that bevel. So we'll bring that up or down as needed. Then there's the number of steps per extrude, and that's up here. Extrude segments, so we can increase that up to maybe 5 or so to increase the level of detail in the extrude area. As we saw with the bevel modifier, we can choose either a morph or a grid structure for the caps, and that's found down here. But we won't see any difference by default because the edges are hidden. With that object still selected, we can just quickly go over to the display panel and disable edges only, and then go back to our Modify panel. Here we see the result of the cap set to Morph type. Let's change that over to Grid, and now we've got a finer structure. Let's zoom in really close with Control-Alt middle mouse. And the last thing we'll want to do to adjust level of detail is control the number of steps along each of the type outlines. And that's done in the interpolation rollout at the top of the TextPlus modifier panel. We can turn Optimize off, and we get steps in between each one of the vertices on the type, even though we can't see the vertices directly. If we orbit around with Alt and middle mouse button, we may see some issues. So for example, in my case, this letter T is getting knocked out when I don't want it to. This is a situation in which the adaptive mode of spline interpolation is actually helpful. I'll turn on adaptive, and that pretty much solves all my problems here. And I can turn those edged faces off again with F4. And now this object is in a pretty good shape to be deformed by, for example, a bend or a twist. Okay, those are some of the advanced options for the TextPlus primitive.